Welcome to Power, People and Planet. I'm Kumi Naidoo, and I want this podcast to break the definition of who is an activist. We have defined an activist as a person who works full-time for an NGO, trade union, and faith organization, and so on. We have to understand that that's an inadequate definition in this moment of history. Pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. One of the key challenges that we face is that we are called upon to mobilize the largest ever level of popular participation and mobilization. And to do that, we'll need to rethink who is an activist. With me today is somebody I look up to and admire, a young leader, Tori Tsui, a colleague at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative and a fellow author. Tori's book is entitled, It's Not Just You. Welcome, Tori. Thank you for joining us on Power, People and Planet. And I'd like to start off with just saying, can you tell us your life journey and your story and how you've landed up doing what you are currently doing?
Thank you so much, Kumi. It's such an honor to be doing this with you. And likewise, I'm a very big fan of the work that you do and everything that you've been doing for the treaty as well, where we both work. So a bit about me. I'm what they call a third culture kid.
A third culture
I was
kid.
born in New Zealand and I grew up in Hong Kong, Australia and the UK. And yeah, a third culture kid. You can't quite, fit in any one place, but you feel like there are parts of you that are kind of intrinsic to various places and cultures all around the world. And now I find myself in the UK. But I think that upbringing has really shaped a lot of my activism, and especially being exposed to a plethora of different environments and communities and ecosystems. So in particular, I grew up in a small fishing town in the northeast of Hong Kong, and like a lot of coastal cities, we were very prone to typhoons and adverse weather. And I think for me, you could say that kick-started my foray into caring about the environment, because when you have something on your doorstep, it's very hard to ignore.
How old were you then, Tori?
And in particular, Hong Kong is the sort of... I grew up in Hong Kong from about the age of being a toddler to 17 is when I first left.
Okay, great.
So that was quite a long period of my life. Yeah. And Hong Kong is a mecca for a lot of wildlife trafficking, unfortunately. And so a lot of my efforts initially started through marine and wildlife conservation, and eventually led me to pursue an academic career. And I was a research scientist for a few years and was about to embark on a PhD. And I thought to myself, I need to slow down and think about what I actually want to do. And I thought maybe science communication was what my strength was. And so I ended up working in the wildlife filmmaking world in the UK, the home of all the Attenborough documentaries. Wow. But I noticed very quickly that my sort of frustrations with the world and how disillusioned I was with climate change and the biodiversity crisis wasn't coinciding neatly with the trajectory of what this industry perpetuated. And what I mean by that is there's a common sort of depiction of the natural world that comes through wildlife storytelling that isn't necessarily an accurate reflection of the world that we live in. And
tell us,
I felt very at odds with that, and I became more political, and I was...
Tell us a little bit more about why it didn't gel. What was the contradictions that you were seeing?
I think, at that particular point in time, I'd been encouraged to go into doing wildlife TV presenting and to be a broadcaster. And I knew that I had a knack for public speaking and for communicating ideas in a way that was perhaps accessible to the layman. And I noticed that the messaging that I would want to share was one of reality, the state of the planet, the sort of reality of the trajectory that we're heading, basically. And I'd been told by a coach that the BBC wouldn't hire me if I continued my activism. I wouldn't get shows. I wouldn't be able to secure a career in presenting. And I walked away. It was as simple as that. And I just continued going to climate protests and engaging with the anti-fossil fuel movement here in the UK, and the rest is history, so they say.
So let me just say that you probably dodged a bullet by because right now you would be sitting in an institution, assuming you were at the BBC, which sadly to say has become, complicit in genocide,
right,
and misinformation on a scale that many people around the world thought that the BBC would be a little more subtle, but their silence in the face of the most brutal violence and genocide in our living history has been deafening. Their silence has been deafening, but more than that, the way they continue to, propagate false, ideas. Now, I want to make a statement and ask you whether you agree with this or not, right? Based on what you said about that connection between societal issues, if you want, and environmental justice in itself. I have said on multiple occasions for a long time now that one of the most grievous errors we have made in the movement to work for climate solutions has been framing the threat of climate change as an environmental issue. I think that was the most grievous area because climate change, in my judgment, happens as a result of a failure of our economic system, our energy system, our transport system, our food system, and so on. So we should have always framed climate action and climate justice as a cross-cutting issue. It's an issue of a failure of all our systems, if you want. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah. It resonates more than words can describe. And there's actually a little bit of a preamble in my book that says that the word climate does a disservice in and of itself to the sort of breadth and depth of this issue. Because while climate is the sort of rhetoric that we roll with and how we have come to communicate a lot of these ideas and these issues, it kind of detracts from, as you mentioned, just how broad and how all-encompassing this issue is, to the point that in my book I actually write it would be more aptly named the result of all systems of oppression crisis, but that doesn't have a ring to it, and that's not very catchy, and that's not very marketable. But I would even go so far as to say climate has become a word that is falling on deaf ears a lot of the time. And so I would even beg, is it as effective as people think as a term to communicate the multiplicity of crises that we're living through? Because it has a tendency to alienate a lot of people. At least from my experience of working with different campaigners from different intersections of society. But of course, when you start to peel back the layers, you realize everything is connected. And you mentioned the genocide that's happening in Palestine. And, this is obviously something that is deeply entrenched in the fight for climate justice. Yet every day I'm met with a sentiment that we need to focus on the environment and not on the genocide, as though the two are somehow separate, which is a thought process that is quite concerning to me, and I endeavor to obviously unpack why that's the case with my work, but it is very entrenched. And there was a moment last month where I was in a room with a lot of different people from the environmental sector, and they were talking about the struggles to find funding for climate. and I'm sure you can speak to this, but one of the folks in the room, I won't name names, was from quite a prominent climate organization in the US. And he had lamented that he was so frustrated that all the funding was going towards Gaza, as though there was somehow a separation between the military industrial complex and what's happening in Palestine. Because the world's military is responsible for 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But I would also make a case to appeal to the humanity of Palestinians and not try and reduce them to carbon parts per million and what's happening to them, because that feels like quite a crude thing. And it makes me really, really question our collective humanity if the only way that we can find compassion for Palestinian people is through this notion of, oh, well, it's harming the physical environment. And that's something to unpack as well.
Well said. Let's stay with the connection between climate and the military-industrial complex. I mean, sometimes people call what's happening in the climate space as the fossil fuel military-industrial complex, and that's what we're dealing with. So, there was a study done in 2002, commissioned by the Pentagon and the CIA to RAND Corporation, and they were asked to look at what in the coming decades will be the biggest threats to peace, stability, and security. And in 2002, they delivered a report to President George W. Bush, which said, in the coming decades, the biggest threat to peace, security, and stability will not come from conventional threats, will not come from terrorism, will actually come from the impacts of climate change. And we are seeing this, and the failure, one of the big failures of many of our movements has been to ignore the wisdom that was given to us by the feminist movement decades ago when they urged us to embrace fully the idea of intersectionality, that we have to understand how different issues intersect. Otherwise, we lose on all of them. The only way we can lift up all the boats of all the agendas of everything that people are fighting for, whether it's economic justice, social justice, indigenous rights justice, anti-colonialism, and so on, we are best able to pick up all of those agendas. And that anecdote that you gave me about the colleague from a US foundation saying that is exactly the problem, right? Because people are wanting to see things in silos when real human beings do not operate in silos. And I don't know whether you know this, but one of my most inspiring one-liners on climate is not from a environmental organization, is from the trade union movement. When the trade union movement started saying there are no jobs on a dead planet, right? There are no jobs on a dead planet. And because the main if I were to summarize two of the reasons we're not winning fast enough or big enough is one, we are insufficiently people-centric in our framing. We don't make it sufficiently about water, about decent work, about, like if you take decent work, for example, there are coal miners who lose their lives all the time or die early because of respiratory illnesses, for example. So why would we not want to do something that is good for the environment, right? Renewable energy, but also good for workers. And we've not sufficiently, elevated that. The second problem is, and I don't know, this is a very self-critical comment.
Right.
90% of the time, when I was the head of Greenpeace, Amnesty, and so on, when I went out in public, I would look at what speaking notes were prepared for me and try to stay as close to it as I could. But oftentimes I would have to deviate because I just realized that we're talking a language that is scientific, it's jargony, it's, you drown in an alphabet soup of acronyms and so on. So give me your reflection on that. And particularly if you want to say a little bit more about the link between climate and the military, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. What you were saying about the sort of jargon that we're using, I find that so often we're in silos and echo chambers with the sort of activism that we talk about and the need to, create a more climate just world. And while I do definitely believe that it only takes a fraction of the population to create long lasting change, I think we would benefit from strength in numbers. And I've met many communities over the years who don't resonate with a lot of the facts and figures, like even 1.5 degrees, which we all know very well within the so-called climate community, the benchmark set out by the Paris Agreement in 2015. It doesn't resonate with a lot of people. 1.5 is so hard to conceptualize and it doesn't feel tangible. I think that's part of the struggle with communicating climate change, is that we're dealing with things that ultimately seem quite abstract that have very concrete implications. And it was interesting when you were talking about the labor movement. I spent some time last year in Belgium with Jeremy Corbyn. We went on a bit of a political tour. We went to a socialism festival and then subsequently met some trade unionists in Ghent in Belgium. And what was really striking for me, and it's not something that's unique to the trade unionists in Ghent, was that there was this sentiment that, of course, we care about the climate. Who wouldn't? But it feels like the politicians who are lobbying for a pro-climate agenda are actually compromising our livelihoods. So while we support the fight for climate justice, we are not being offered opportunities to upskill, to transition to more ethical and cleaner forms of working and operating in the energy sector. A lot of them actually worked in non-renewable energy and also in petrochemicals. And so they said, well, we care about our livelihoods. We're already, struggling to make ends meet. And I feel like that's such a huge short-sightedness of people who work in the environmental sector, is that capital is ultimately impacted by the workers. The way that we create mass change in society has always been through strong connected movements. And this, labor movement is such a powerhouse of people who have such a huge opportunity to impact the way that we head in society. And for many of them to feel left behind or like the environmental movement doesn't advocate for them is a great failing on our part. So it was very, very insightful to have spent some time with them. Now, on the subject of, the connection between the military-industrial complex and fossil fuels, I obviously mentioned that if the military were a country, it would be, worth 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it would be the fourth largest emitter in the world. And the US military is the single biggest industrial carbon emitter. But, I think that sort of mentality or that statement is not really reflected, I find, in a lot of climate negotiations. I've not really heard it in any UNFCCC spaces before. And there are researchers who have commented that, that politics or a lack of expertise mean that reports that are coming out of the UNFCCC are silent on military emissions. And without international agreements on accountability and monitoring and the cutting of military emissions, it kind of remains a low priority, despite the fact that war and this genocide, for instance, is having not only a huge impact on the physical environment, but also the livelihoods of people and leads to further political and social instability. And, the oil and gas industry and the military industrial complex and politics are all in bed with one another. I mean, there is a prominent example from the US where Lockheed Martin donated $75,000 US to house Armed Services Committee Chair Representative Mac Thornberry in the US. And then he later passed a bill that would benefit Lockheed Martin. And we see these things happening all the time. And the US, and obviously the place that I'm living at the moment, the UK, are deeply complicit in the genocide of Palestinians. And a huge part of that is through the funding. I mean, there's over 130 billion US dollars that's been provided by the US in bilateral assistance to pro-Israeli interest groups. And that's also something that we're seeing here in the UK, like the Labour government, which I wouldn't even really call Labour anymore. I call it Diet Tory, Diet Conservative. Keir Starmer has been receiving a lot of donations and funds from pro-Israeli lobby groups. And, you know, it's all part of the same problem. And so for me, when I see people campaigning against the military, this is directly a form of climate activism. It is a climate justice fight. And I think that when we're seeing the proscription of groups like Palestine Action here in the UK, which you can literally get jailed for saying that you support them, that is a direct indication that because these actionists are targeting, whether it be the factories that are manufacturing jets, the companies that are providing technological assistance to Israel, this is a direct reflection of the fact that they are harming this whole operation, this whole instigation of a genocide at the core. And that is why they have been prescribed as terrorists, because they're actively getting in the way of the very foundations of what is causing this genocide. So, you know, it is, to me, a no-brainer to campaign against the military, to support Palestinians, to support the fight for Palestinian liberation, not, you know, this sort of wishy-washy two-state solution where we're trying to ignore the occupation and the ethnic cleansing of the people who are indigenous to these lands, and actual, you know, radical support and movement which champions their right to freedom and liberation.
So, Tori, that's a good segue to the question of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative itself, because you pointed out the tension between aggressively pushing for actions that reduce emissions and address the climate, but without thinking about jobs and just transition and so on. Can you just, for those of our listeners who have not heard about the treaty, can you just describe, when you are explaining to the people in any audience what the treaty is about, how do you go about it, and then also if you can specifically speak about the just transition component and how critical it is for us to succeed in securing a safe and just planet for future generations.
Of course. So you and I both work at the treaty, and I'm a big supporter of what the treaty stands for. And I think a huge part of that is to acknowledge that the Paris Agreement, which tried to keep us within 1.5 degrees of warming, requires a complementary framework to actually make sure that that is kept alive. And I think the treaty does exactly just that by specifically focusing on fossil fuels, because 86% of all carbon emissions from the last decade are owed to coal, oil, and gas. And the fossil fuel industry has no sign of slowing down, benefiting from 11 million US dollars of subsidies every minute. And the reality is that our own UNFCCC framework, and specifically Paris, fails to mention coal, oil, and gas, which to me is an indicator that we need something to really name the culprits and actually target them explicitly. And the thing is, you know, fossil fuels were only really mentioned for the first time in UNFCCC processes in Dubai, which was
just over 2 years ago.
So while transitioning away from fossil fuels, just over 2 years ago, right? So while transitioning away from fossil fuels is a historic and important signal that was made in Dubai, it was surrounded by loopholes, and many countries have subsequently continued with expansion. And the reality is that efforts within the UNFCCC have been difficult for almost 30 years. I mean, I wouldn't know the entirety of this because I wasn't alive, but from what I've heard from colleagues and also just, being in these spaces, it's tricky because it's a universal consensus-based treaty, and currently any major fossil fuel producer can block efforts to explicitly address coal, oil, and gas. So I think the treaty offers this fresh and invigorating and exciting opportunity to, strengthen Paris, to make commitments to phasing out coal, oil, and gas, and to providing countries with the necessary resources and infrastructure to do so. And, as you're aware, the treaty is spearheaded by many nation states who are often from low-lying island states, most vulnerable nations. And I think the fact that it is a block of some of the most vulnerable countries sends a very strong signal to the rest of the world. And there are three key elements to the treaty. First is to end the expansion of fossil fuel extraction. The second one is to wind down existing production in keeping with the science. And then the third, which relates to the sort of question that you'd asked me, accelerate a global, fair and financed transition to distributed and renewable and sustainable energy sources and other low carbon solutions. And I think that last part is very key because the fairness is something that I really want to reiterate, is there is an element to this where we need to be cognizant of the power imbalances that exist in this world, the countries that don't necessarily have the same access to resources and finances to transition to a renewable economy, the countries that have been absolutely consumed by debt from the global north. And I remember when we were in Brazil for the G20, there was a comment that you made which really stuck with me, and I think is something that needs to be understood. When countries in the global north are supporting countries in the global south, this isn't charity. It's an obligation, it's a duty. And I think this notion of charity almost detracts from the culpability of those in the global north for perpetuating this crisis. So I feel as though the treaty makes a very clear and concrete statement around culpability, around responsibility, around accountability. And we cannot achieve climate justice without acknowledging that.
Thank you so much for that, Tori. So, Tori, I don't know whether you have heard me say this, that mentioning fossil fuels, which is 86% of the cause of what drives climate change, 28 years after you start negotiating for a climate solution in Rio in 1992, it's like Alcoholics Anonymous having 28 years of conferences, and it takes them 28 years before they can find the courage to say alcohol in the outcome document. And the reason for that, if I stay with the Alcoholics Anonymous analogy, is because if we look at year in, year out, the largest delegation to these climate negotiations, overwhelmingly so, is not the United States, it's not the European Union, it's the lobbyists of the fossil fuel industry. That's like Alcoholics Anonymous having a big global conference to address alcohol, and the largest delegation to the conference is the alcohol industry. It's absurd, right? It really is absurd, and needs to be challenged, and I'm glad that people are challenging it. Now, with the momentum, if you can just say a little bit about how you are seeing, I mean, the vision is for the treaty, you've been there longer, so correct me if I'm wrong. The vision is really to follow the route that the landmine treaty followed, which was, it was negotiated outside of the UN system. 44 nations signed the treaty, and then it was taken into the UN system. Because I'm sure many people listening to us now will say, hey, if the US at the moment is pushing us in another direction, how can we move forward? And we need to remind people that, the US constitutes less than 5% of the world's population, that the global south is actually 88% of the global's population, astonishingly so. Most people don't realize that. And we have to begin to convince our brothers and sisters in the global north, right, that what we are asking for in terms of climate finance is historical redress, right? Because, we can say we want climate justice, but if we say what is climate injustice? Climate injustice is the fact that the people in the Pacific Island states, in low-lying places like Bangladesh and so on, even though they have contributed least to the problem in terms of emissions over time, they are the ones that are paying the first and most brutal price. So we want to be very, very clear that we're not asking for charity. We are asking for historical redress, pay your climate debt. You built your economies on colonialism, exploitation, and fossil fuel, expansion. Yeah. So I want to go back to the issue of how we communicate and why, in fact, we need to do much better there, right? And I know that you have been working with Brian Eno from Earth%. You've done things with various artists to draw attention on the genocide in Palestine. Tell us a little bit more about the concert, the efforts that you're engaged in, and more importantly, tell us about your own music, and whether you'd like to share something with us.
Well, thank you very much. That's a great question. So before we quickly head into that, I just want to say thank you for just hitting the nail on the head there with everything that you mentioned. I like the Alcoholics Anonymous analogy, and also I'm sure you've heard of the one about the tobacco industry and actually how the fossil fuel industry is also using exactly the same tactics that the tobacco industry did. And, we had the tobacco industry sponsoring the WHO conferences. It's exactly the same. And I find that in terms of communication, using that as an example, people go, oh yeah, I can see how messed up that is. Because there used to be this sort of, and still is this rhetoric that, oh, but, they're the ones causing the problem. So they should be in the rooms and they should be the ones there supporting this movement. And I'm like, I understand why you think that. But look at what the tobacco industry did. Would you say the same thing now? And people go, oh, okay, I get it. So, it's a very, very sneaky and surreptitious way that they infiltrate our decision-making spaces and hijack the conversations in their favor. So working with Brian Eno, I've been working with Brian since 2020. Yeah, he founded an organization called Earth%, which is an initiative within the music industry to galvanize momentum around supporting climate initiatives and also kind of taking funds from the music industry and redistributing it into different climate justice causes. And I work with him as a lead advisor on, the different projects that we support. But Brian has always been a very staunch and vocal advocate for the fight for Palestinian liberation. And like him and many others in our network, there is a very vocal and obvious connection between climate and the Palestinian fight for liberation. So over the last year or so, with the escalation of the genocide, there have been conversations around how do we actually create a cultural moment that's not a celebration by any means, and not a jolly, and not something that undermines the resistance taking place on the front lines. How do we create a cultural moment which sheds light on not only the genocide, but also the solidarity and community and people power to say people support the Palestinian people. People are supporting this fight for freedom. People see that there is a very, very clear aggressor in this situation, and that all of the tools of the playbook which try to undermine advocating for a free Palestine will not be, supported per se. So what I mean by that is, creating this cultural moment where that it's not a black and it's not a sort of it is a black and white thing. It is something where it's like, yes, Israel is committing a genocide. No ifs, no buts. This is the reality. And I think that's what Together for Palestine is in many ways. It's a concert that's taking place in Wembley on the 17th of September, featuring a really stellar lineup of artists who want to use their musical platforms to show support for the Palestinian people. It is a fundraising initiative that will redirect funds to 3 organizations on the ground in Gaza. And, fundraising is obviously one element of it. We know that fundraising is not the end goal. All of us know that in order to end a system of oppression like this, you need to really tackle it at the core. But it's, I think, part of this multiplicity of theories of change that contribute to an overarching shift in society. And it reminds me of an analogy where sometimes we feel like we're not making an impact. And if we see an issue as like a piece of cloth, even if you're pulling at one thread, it's contributing to the unraveling of the entire piece. And so I see the concert as that. It's one way of pulling the thread that is Zionism and the propaganda around Israel. So yeah, it's going to be taking place on the 17th of September. It's such an honor and a privilege to be working on it, and also to be working alongside some brilliant Palestinian artists and curators and producers. I feel as though it's going to be one of those things that goes down in history. And I'm sure that you can also talk about the impact of art in creating significant cultural moments also with, apartheid in South Africa and all of these sort of different tactics and theories of change that were employed to challenge the status quo. There is a really deep-seated feeling in all of us that this is history that we are witnessing, and it will be part of what people reflect on in the next 100 years. And this has been one of the biggest shortcomings of our times, failing the Palestinian people.
Okay. Thank you, Tori. I am keen for you to offer either a poem or a song that you particularly like, and you can sing it or you can tell us and we'll play it. Is there something that stands out for you? Because maybe I'll just preface that by saying that, one of the biggest reflections in my life, which was kind of made very clear by our son, Ricky Rick, where we set up a foundation after his passing. By the way, we are in his studio where we're recording now. And Ricky basically was saying the reason why my generation has failed is that we've aimed all our messages at the brain and we've ignored the heart, the body, and the soul. So the Ricky Rick Foundation for the Promotion of Artivism, which is where, my family and I put a lot of our time. In fact, it's almost like a full-time other job. We've built this global movement called the Global Artivism Movement. We had an inaugural global conference in South Africa with 89 countries, 750 people last year in September. And we are just going now to Salvador, Bahia, Brazil, for the second global convening, which will be from the 3rd to the 5th of November, just before the high-level segment of the COP starts in Belém in the Amazon.
Yeah.
So I have no doubt that the words that come out of the mouths of boring kind of conventional activist like myself, its impact is minuscule compared to a song, a poem, a dance, a visual piece of art. And I think right now why artivism is so important, it's not only that it helps us to take the message to a much larger audience, but we need artists in our movements because they have the capability,
100%.
of imagining worlds that are yet to be born. I was just saying to somebody that I was saying to somebody the other day, people of my generation who watch Star Trek, right? There was a thingy there in Star Trek that looked completely science fiction to us, right? This was in the 80s.
Yeah.
That thing that looked completely impossible in science fiction is, in fact, the iPad today. If you take, there was a kind of bit of a cheesy television series called Knight Rider, which was about a car that could drive itself, right? That was in the 80s. And, everybody thought impossible, never happened. And look, we're seeing things happening. So can you just reflect for you about why the power of arts and culture is important? And if there's anything you'd like to offer, because we're trying to get some... Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. You were talking about all of these inventions that have existed in TV and film, and I am still waiting for the day for those hoverboard shoes from Back to the Future. I dream about them all the time, and I'm waiting for someone probably has made them, but they've yet to hit the commercial space. Or maybe we don't want that because we don't want to promote mass consumption of unnecessary things. So, but oh man, if we're taking music, for instance, to be honest, any form of art, it has always been political. And I kind of want to share something with you that I found really, really funny. So I've been working with Massive Attack a little bit. And, last year they did this incredible initiative, actually not too far from where I am in Bristol, called Act 1.5. And it was a really record-breaking, groundbreaking climate concert initiative. And it was very political. There were loads of, depictions of Gaza and talking about the military-industrial complex and also challenging fascism and the rise of authoritarianism around the world. And there was even Motaz, the journalist from Palestine, who gave a keynote. And I was with Palestine Solidarity, Bristol, and I had my flag and was wearing my keffiyeh. And there was a man who was in the audience who was just like, why are you bringing that here? You're getting in the way, just very disgruntled. And I thought, what are you doing at a Massive Attack concert? And I thought that maybe he was just an anomaly. And he probably is in many respects. But earlier this year, Massive Attack invited me to speak on stage at their concert in Manchester in front of 15,000 people. And they had just endorsed the fossil fuel treaty. And it would feel, like a wasted opportunity to not mention the connection between the military, fossil fuels, and the fight for justice. And my manager was in the audience, and she was telling me that there was this guy next to her saying, why are you bringing politics into this? Leave us out of this. And I just kept thinking, what are you doing at a bloody Massive Attack concert? How can he possibly sit through the entirety of the concert and not register the fact that there is literal, anti-war messaging, anti-Israeli messaging? The whole show was covered in political messaging. Massive Attack has always been political. So for me, it's just super fascinating to see that people can remove themselves so much from the art that they're surrounded by. And I think that is a level of dissonance that I just can't comprehend. Because I feel like the role of the artist is to communicate the times that we live in, whatever that looks like, whether it means reflecting the hyper commercialization of music and the way that there are songs just literally being turned out and people turned into totems and cultural icons with mass followings. That's also a reflection of the times. And then you have the more overtly political bands and musicians who are speaking directly about what we're bearing witness to. And for me, it's such an inherent part of music that anyone who questions why we're bringing politics into music needs to take a good hard look at history and how so much of the legacy of musicians over the last however many years has always integrated politics. I think about punk, and I want a punk revival more than anything. And I think about Stevie Wonder and the Birthday Song and how that was a way of essentially championing the civil rights movement. I think about, while it's not necessarily the way that I think a lot of concerts should be done, all the benefit concerts that have happened over the years and how that was very much part of that culture then. And I will preface by saying that the Together for Palestine concert is directly avoiding the white savior trope because we know that that is a big issue. So I'm not going to completely glamorize it, but it's always been there. And yeah, I think that for me, as I'm embarking on a musical journey, and I'll send you a song that maybe you can integrate into the podcast and edit in, I just find it impossible to write music that is not about the times that we live in, that is not inherently political. I had a song that I wrote with a friend of mine who's also a musician called Kieran Austin, and it's called Storm Season, and it integrates a lot of sounds of storms and natural disasters, which I actually prefer to call unnatural disasters, into the sort of melody of the song. And it's about the us lamenting about the frustrations of the world, but then also the second half of the song really ties together this notion of people power and uprisings and revolutions and how, there's a revolution that's brewing. And it reminds me a lot of Rebecca Solnit's work. I'm such a big fan of what she does, where she talks about, she talks about this analogy of the mushroom.
Mycelium.
And I'm a huge fan of the mycelial network. I'm a massive mycophile. I mean, everyone who knows me knows I'm a little bit obsessed. And she talks about how revolutions often seem spontaneous, but actually there's vital groundwork, the mycelial network, which has laid the foundations to these uprisings and to these movements. And those things are very, very beneath the surface. And if you're peeking beneath the surface like we are, because we're part of that mycelial network, we're part of people trying to create change, you can feel this tension brewing. But this really palpable momentum as well of people feeling like change is afoot. And I know that often doesn't look pretty. Revolutions don't necessarily look pretty, and they never will, and that's okay. But I think the art allows for us to communicate this in a way that's perhaps more accessible to people who shy away from the violence and the sort of the friction that results out of a revolution. So I'm very much a supporter of all forms of action, but the art for me is a huge way of trying to reach the masses who feel slightly alienated by direct action and theories of change. And I think it recognizes the potential for everyone to be a change maker. So I'm very privileged to be working in this sector.
Beautifully said, Tori. There are many people listening to this, right, who were and are asking the questions perpetually. Why is it that the majority of people in the world, from the United States to China to every region of the world, want action on addressing the threat of climate? The majority of people want equal rights between men and women. The majority of people want us to respect people's choices to choose to be whoever they want to and to choose their own sexual orientation and so on, right? But why is it that our democratic systems don't deliver policy outcomes that resonate with what majority of people want? So even, so when you look at it, the main reason I would say is that we have not spoken to people in a way that moves them in their very hearts and souls. We have been a
Yeah.
bit too jargony, and also I want to say a bit too disrespectful, right? What I mean by that,
Yeah.
you know, we don't respect the fact. We should ask ourselves, if somebody says Netanyahu is a great human being, even though he's driving genocide, then rather than just saying that person is crazy, mad, whatever, is it not more productive to say, let us understand, how did that mind get to that point? Because I would say that one of the biggest errors
100%.
we make at the moment is we think that backward fascist-leaning governments control us by the deployment primarily of the repressive state apparatus, army, police, formal laws, and so on. But actually, the biggest form of control they exercise, as has been said before, is the ideological state apparatus, which is the framework for,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's the framework of education, framework for religion, framework for funding of arts and culture, the framework particularly of the communications and media landscape. And today, you have that landscape completely dominated by the very fossil fuel interests that we are fighting against to get a climate solution.
Yeah.
I remember being
Absolutely.
in Russia a couple of years ago. I get told by my colleagues, oh, you know, most of the media here is state-owned, but there is this one radio station that they offer alternative. So I go, and the interview was actually quite good. I said whatever I wanted to say and so on. And then when I come out of the interview, I asked the producer, by the way, who funds this station? And the person said, Gazprom, the largest gas and oil companies in the world, actually. So as we move to rounding up, I want to just express some jealousy, okay? So I wish I had embraced the power of arts and culture much earlier, as you in my trajectory as an activist, and you have done that so beautifully with arts and culture being such a big part of it, including, by the way, your book, which is, you know, obviously a cultural contribution in itself. I want to read to you something that you said, where you said, in fact, and my publishers might not like to hear this, but I would consider it more successful if more people signed up for different climate causes than bought my book. Now, I could tell you that. So, some of your critics might say, oh, that's a really nice thing to say because more people probably will buy your book because you said that. But I have the same approach, right? So I have the same sense of saying, because my book, which was called Letters to My Mother, The Making of a Troublemaker, which covers my early activism, but, you know, reflects a little bit of the moment. And you and I, in a sense, were driven to write because of the mental health crisis and the eco-anxiety and the climate anxiety and so on that we speak. So I want to end with you reflecting on this, but also, what do you say to people in the world generally, but particularly to young people? What's your message to say? Basically, you probably heard my mantra where I say, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford, and the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experience, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our action, our creativity, our courage, and our sense of humanity. So, as we round up, what's your message to young people who wake up every day and they feel they are receiving body blows from fascism, from climate denialism, from genocide, and so on? What's your message to them at a very personal level? How do you keep your spirits up? And let me throw it to you, and then I'll reciprocate and tell you what's my optimistic message to the moment. Okay, so you go first.
Mm, mm. Thank you. I really do agree with what you said about pessimism being a luxury. And I think that some people might conflate that with not grieving and not feeling hurt and sadness at the state of the world. But actually, I spend a lot of my time grieving. I spend a lot of my time feeling very viscerally about the world, but I don't let that guide my willingness and enthusiasm to continue the work that I'm doing. So I recognize that it's just a part of the process, and I need to compost and sit with these emotions and actually let them transform into action. And writing my book, I often joke that it's a bit of a catfish because it has eco anxiety in the title, which by all means is a very real and tangible experience that many people, especially a lot of young people, are experiencing. But it's actually quite a deep dive into how capitalism is bad for our mental health and how we have been sold this neoliberal capitalist version of care that is actually just highly commodified and reinforces the system in place. And what I mean by that is I make a case for how mental health care is not only, adequate housing and security and resources and, community and access to nature, but it's also dismantling the fossil fuel industry. Because if the fossil fuel industry is the leader of the climate crisis, my case that I make in the book is that actually, for me, campaigning against the fossil fuel industry is a form of long-term mental health care, while the actual act of campaigning may come with some trials and tribulations and stresses, as we all know. And, activism isn't easy and it can be very traumatic sometimes. Overall, I'm contributing, I think, to a world where I'm trying to lessen the impacts of the climate crisis, where every fraction of a degree matters. Every, gallon of oil that we keep in the ground is the difference between someone suffering and not suffering. And so I like to frame it in that way. And I think my message to young people who are feeling despair about the state of the world or feeling grief is that you're very valid for doing so. We're not going to pathologize this, as I've seen some people try and lump in eco-anxiety alongside other so-called mental health illnesses and disorders, which also warrants further analysis because, as we know, there is so much systemic injustice that leads to mental health illness, and also there are a lot of people from marginalized backgrounds who are more likely to be diagnosed with certain conditions by virtue of being oppressed in this world. So that's a whole other conversation. But I reiterate that it's not a pathology. You're reacting very rationally to a time which is utterly irrational. And in fact, I would be more concerned if you weren't reacting in a so-called negative way. I think I say to them that it is a sign of your humanity. It is a sign that your humanity is intact. It is a sign that you are a human being who cares deeply about this place that we call home. And that is a gift. It is a gift, and it is a sensitivity and sensibility that can be harnessed to create a world that you see as more just, as more fit for all of humanity. And I just like to leave people with that there is a strength and a power to feeling so deeply. I'm a very sensitive person. I would not be the person I am today and do the activism that I do without that sensitivity, without those trials and tribulations and mental health struggles. I would not be an activist, and I know that for a fact. So yeah, it's a reassurance that you're not alone, and also that there is an innate strength to who you are as a person. And as I mentioned, I see dismantling the fossil fuel industry as a form of mental health care. It is a call to arms to people to seek that community that not only holds them in their darkest days, but holds them accountable to do the work that we need to do in order to create a more just world.
So very well said, Tori. So let me just round up with these words, right? So I want to tell everybody listening to us, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So I want to say, please take the message from Tori, find your way to get actively involved, and you can join the climate struggle and buy Tori's book at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. the, the, the second thing I want to say to everybody listening is find joyful ways to get involved, right? Find ways that celebrate your life. So what Tori said about grieving is not in contradiction to being optimistic, because actually I am exactly like you. I grieve for what we've lost. My city that I grew up in, Durban, in 2 days, 3 years ago, we lost 450 people in a flooding incident that we've never seen anything like that before. So for those, when people ask, is it too late? Is it too late to act on climate change? For those people and the people that are dying already from climate impacts because our leaders do not act, it's too late for them. But the optimistic thing is we are still in that window of opportunity where it is within human capability, creativity, and ingenuity that we can broaden that opportunity, move us away from the suicidal trajectory that humanity is on, and create a solution. So people should remember that the science uses 3 words: catastrophic, irreversible, runaway climate change. Where are we now? Thankfully, we are not at runaway. We are getting close. We're not at irreversible. We're getting close. On catastrophe, let's be very clear. We're in the early stages of catastrophe already based on the kinds of losses that we are seeing. So I invite you all, in conclusion, join the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. You can join as an individual supporter. If you belong to an organization or a network, in the faith community, in the trade union community, in your local grassroots community, you can join up as an organization. Get your city where you live to endorse the treaty as a way of building up pressure from bottom below.
So I remember how this flowed at 17, when my mind was not at peace, but I would find it in the trees. I would cycle out for hours by the flowers and the bees, with all the recitals in the breeze that would hide in my belief that even if I felt unease, the world would show me I belong, and I would feel a sense of beauty that I could channel into song. Anytime outside I wanted to prolong, then I lost my naivety and saw it going wrong. And now outside my window there's a storm. End of 2024, there's more flooding up north. How do I let it go when I can feel it to my core? New generations feel the force of frustration and remorse. So the wind is raging and my mind is racing. I think of all these places I adore. The sounds of nature around me seem to distort. I've been holding out for a future but can't be sure. So
they say storms come and go. This time's not the same. The world is on her knees, begging, please hear my broken symphony. Hear our mother's plea.
I think of all the times that you have shown me patience, all the observation, every occasion I felt amazement. The awe I felt when I studied the constellations. Do we care about conservation? We're needing a conversation, aren't we? So even if I might know less, I can't be made to feel apathetic. I had to protest. The greed is truly grotesque, it's hard to even process. Motionless, but I cannot be feeling hopeless, cause I'm in this world, it really troubles me. But I still think of all the love that covers me. Abundance singing from the trees and birds song in this harmony. My deepest hope is close to seeing nature in recovery. Resilience, discovery. I feel alive when I float in the ocean, stare at the sky. Had to record this as we're running out of time, and we could open up our minds if we could listen to your cries. So I don't know.
Slow it down, hear me out. We just gotta stop and listen. It's all part of the system to a bend. Stand up, stand your ground. There's a revolution round the corner, so rise up for a flora and fauna, make amends. Slow it down and hear me out. Just need to stop and listen. It's all part of the system to a bend. Stand up, stand your ground. The world's gonna keep on turning, so when you're gonna stop the burning?
What if tackling climate change starts with rethinking who holds power? I'm Candace Lewis-Wilson, Senior Program Director at Center for Public Impact.
And I'm Gabrielle Barron, Senior Program Manager in the Climate Action Team at the Centre for Public Impact. We're the new hosts of Reimagining Government. In Season 4, we're exploring what happens when those too often excluded from decision-making lead the way.
Across 6 episodes, we'll spotlight leaders who are transforming how we respond to the climate crisis.
They're redesigning cities, challenging climate colonialism, defending the Amazon, mobilizing global activism, and bringing youth voices into politics and policy. At its heart, this season isn't about carbon emissions.
It's about power, who has it, how it's shared, and how reimagining leadership from the ground up can reshape the future of government for everyone. Subscribe and listen now, wherever you get your podcasts.
So, Tori, once again, thank you so very much for your time. This podcast, Power, People and Planet, was initiated in partnership with the Green Economy Coalition. We are now in the 3rd series. So I invite you to share this. And then I'm a bit of a digital immigrant, as you might guess. So let me just say, like, share, and subscribe. I hope I got the 3 words right. And
You did.
thank you so much for your time, Tori, and good luck with everything that you're working with, and continue to be the inspiration to me and others that you are. Thank you so much.